3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running.
There is no other institution that has the ability, uniquely,
without a heritage, every generation starts over.
Ask not
to remind the current regime
what your country...
We, the people, tell the government what it is allowed to do.
to get back in their box and stay there.
Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
From the Heritage Foundation, this is Heritage Explains.
I think the war could end soon. How soon? Within weeks. Weeks? Yeah, I think so. Right? Don't you think so?
This is President Trump answering questions from the press in the Oval Office this week. Seated next to him is French President Emmanuel Macron. They had been discussing the war between Russia and Ukraine, now in its third year.
I think we could end it within weeks if we're smart. If we're not smart, it'll keep going and we'll keep losing young, beautiful people that shouldn't be dying. And we don't want that. And remember what I said, this could escalate into a third world war. And we don't want that either.
Obviously, President Trump's posture toward the war is very different from his predecessor. To understand what we might expect to see in Ukraine over the next few weeks, months, and years, I sat down with Rob Greenway, director of the Allison Center for National Security here at the Heritage Foundation. Rob Greenway, welcome back to Heritage Explains.
Great to be on. Thanks for having me, Mark.
So, we've been hearing a lot about Ukraine in the news over the last couple of days. Can you tell us, first off, what is the status of the conflict?
Yeah, the conflict's essentially frozen. There's been little progress made on either side over the last 2 years. In total, in the last 3 years, and we just hit the 3-year anniversary of the conflict, some 20% of Ukraine's landmass is now occupied, more or less, by Russian forces. Both sides are eager for a stalemate, and the cost associated with the conflict is staggering in the public domain based on what we know. And there's grave concerns, of course, about Russia's future intentions and the impact on a changing and very dynamic political landscape in Europe that is racked with economic issues as well as immigration issues, which should sound familiar because they're similar problems that we experience here in the United States.
So when you talk a little bit about cost, can you give us a sense of the cost of this conflict, both in terms of the resources that have been spent as well as human life?
Sure. It's difficult to put a definitive number on it. The conflict has taken a toll that numbers in millions. That's both uniformed personnel on both sides of the conflict, but more so the civilian cost, especially in Ukraine, has been staggering. And that includes all ages. And so millions have been killed and wounded in the conflict over the last 3 years, and probably hundreds of billions of dollars of economic impact. And you'll recall that both Ukraine and Russia accounted for some 50% of the world's wheat output. But it's not just a disruption to the food market. It's a disruption of Ukraine's entire economy. And the disruption, of course, to Europe's economy, because up until this point, as President Trump famously warned European colleagues in his first administration, that there was a dangerous dependence on Russian natural gas in particular to sustain Russia's economy. And this is the deal made between Angela Merkel, former prime minister in Germany, and Vladimir Putin previously. And again, President Trump warned, Congress acted in order to prevent this from happening, and it turned to be a deadly negotiation that had dire consequences. And when that was severed as a result of the conflict, Europe's economy has really reeled to adjust itself and is still adjusting itself. And that has been a massive economic detriment to the continent.
President Trump has now been in office for a little over a month, and he has a very different approach to the Ukraine conflict compared to his predecessor. Can you talk about that change? That's
right. In less than a month, and of course, look, it's important to remember he campaigned and won on, among other things, introducing peace and pursuing peace as a matter of policy, and he is acting accordingly, and I think people respect it. I think there are 4 things that President Trump is doing that should give us all some encouragement. The first is that he has made this a priority, that he has begun the process of negotiations and having conversations with everyone involved in the conflict. He's the first to actually bring the Russians to the table in Riyadh and Saudi Arabia with members of his team. And I think he should be given credit for doing it because no one else has managed to achieve that in the last 3 years. Second, he has recognized that there is an economic and security component to this, right? They're interdependent. And we talked a little bit about it in terms of the cost and the impact and some of the causes and results and consequences of the conflict. And what that means specifically is developing a long-term economic relationship with Ukraine, which is described as a mineral arrangement. But I think it's broader than that, which may be signed as early as this week in Washington. And that is important for two reasons. First is it's going to be important to ensure that Ukraine is viable economically now and after a conflict is brought to termination, so that the cost, if nothing else, is reduced, but also so that the people of Ukraine have a path forward. Second, I think it's important for the U.S. to have a vested interest that it would protect and defend, and I think that's an important signal. It's short of Ukraine in NATO, which the president has not supported, and I think that's right. But I think it's still a demonstration of commitment. Third, he's also recognized that the conflict for the U.S. is broader than just the European conflict between Russia and Ukraine. This includes, unfortunately, much closer cooperation in the axis of resistance. That's Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And that cooperation, which takes many forms, has been perhaps the most threatening development, and I think the president's right to recognize it, and it's within the scope of negotiation, and I think it's the grand bargain that President Trump is pursuing. And so all told, I think what the president has managed to accomplish in a very short period of time is to start to lay the foundations for the enduring peace that he seeks and that European continent needs. The last thing I'll say is critical here, and it gets a lot of attention, and that is, what does Europe need to do? Look, Europe, as he pointed out in his first term, was committing far too little of its resources for its collective defense and was far too dependent upon the United States. We have global commitments. Europeans have to take a greater share of responsibility for their own security. And just for some context, in the early days of NATO, since 1947, there were nations, including Germany, that were committing upwards of 10% of its gross domestic product as a percentage for national defense. But the reality is that NATO has grown immeasurably in size, scope, and number of nations since 1947. It now has a GDP collectively that's grown by $40 trillion, and that exceeds what the Russians certainly are able to bring to bear. And its population has grown substantially, and yet its commitment financially and the number of service members under arms has reduced dramatically. This has to change. President Trump pointed this out, and I think now they realize the consequences of neglecting their own defense and are now starting the process of committing, and they'll have to continue to do it. In other words, if Europe wants to ensure that Putin is not continuing to pose a threat to NATO and their own security, they're going to have to commit more of their resources. And that should contribute to the deterrence, and it should equip them better in the future. And I hope that's what happens. That's what President Trump has called for.
Negotiations are now underway, or at least conversations about negotiations are underway. Can you give us a sense of how those are shaping up?
So they are underway. As I said, the president's team met with Vladimir Putin's team in Riyadh. General Kellogg, the special envoy, was just in Kiev talking to Ukrainian President Zelensky. The president has spoken with all parties, both Putin and Zelensky, as well as European partners. French President Macron was here in Washington just yesterday. So the conversations, the dialogues are ongoing. This, I suspect, is to stake out, the interests of all sides, which are more or less well known, and to identify where the trade space is. And as the president said in the press conference with the French president, he's a deal maker. That's what he has done and continues to do. And so I think he and his team are looking for where this trade space is and how they can get as quickly as possible to an effective and enduring peace. And I think they ought to be given the time to do it. Everyone is quick to criticize and to suspect what the outcome might be. I think the reality is that these are the same people that failed to prevent the conflict from happening. They failed to do anything about it in the last 3 years. They ought to give the president a little more than a month that he's had in order to make progress on it. And so far, I think signs are positive.
Do we have any sense of what a deal might look like?
I think there are a couple of broad principles that have been discussed. In the end, right, it comes down to the possession of territory, right? The extent to which Russia will retain control of any of the territory that it had in the previous conflict or from the current conflict. And I think there is obviously a negotiation, right? So somewhere between Where they started and where they are currently at, somewhere in between that. Suffice to say, there will probably be some movement in terms of what Russia has left. I think there's probably going to be some form of monitoring force on the ground. The president has excluded the possibility of American troops, but Europeans, I think, have certainly been part of the discussion. That could certainly be part of it. And we've already talked about the economic relationship, not just between the United States and Ukraine, but between European countries in the reconstruction effort. So I think those are the three sort of principal tenets. The only one that doesn't get discussed as much, but I alluded to earlier, and that's the grand bargain the president is seeking to reduce the cooperation between Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. That one, I suspect, more sensitive, more private. It may be a while before we see the details emerge. It's clear it's a priority for the president and his team, as it should be.
I want to ask you two questions about some common concerns that we're seeing kind of in the media about this. The first one has to do with Russia, and the second one has to do with China. In regards to Russia, some are saying that they feel that by coming to the negotiating table, that President Trump is conceding an invasion by a foreign nation of Ukraine, and that he's conceding too much moral ground there. What do you respond? What do you think about that?
There's no way to negotiate without discussions. The act of negotiation requires that you meet and exchange ideas. It's a little bit specious to argue that the act of meeting the Russians is tantamount to concessions. We haven't seen concessions yet. We haven't seen the contours of the deal. I don't understand the argument, to be honest. I think there's no way to proceed without a discussion and a dialogue. And in fact, this is what everyone points to on numerous occasions. People are talking about having dialogue with Hamas and terrorist organizations, with the Taliban in Afghanistan, even with the new government of Hayat Tahrir al-Sham in Syria. So everyone talks about dialogue with a wide variety of groups, but somehow now manages to exclude it. There's no way to proceed without conversations and dialogue. Dialogue or not tantamount to concessions. We haven't seen that yet. So I think it's presumptive, and I think it's a little bit disingenuous to criticize discussions.
The second concern is having to do with China. And there's a suggestion that if the deal winds up with Russia retaining some of this land that they have gained over the course of this war, that would signal to entities like China that they could then engage in some sort of similar land grab strategies, particularly around Taiwan. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, clearly we want to discourage it. It's a grave threat to U.S. interests and a severe violation of international law to permit and to tolerate the acquisition of territory unwarranted. And I think that's accepted. The problem, of course, is you're left with trying to navigate what Russia has done and how to reverse that and the costs, right? Is the United States and is Europe willing to bear the costs of the restoration of Ukraine's territorial integrity? Is there a plan to do it? Are resources been committed to it? And the answer to that is no. There hasn't in the last 3 years been posited a plan to do it, and the resources required have not been made manifest, which is why it hasn't happened. And so we're left with trying to, I think, come to something a little bit closer to what we've seen in the North Korean, South Korean conflict, and is sort of get to a stasis in which they're no longer in active conflict with one another. They both have territorial claims against the other. And this is not unique to the Korean Peninsula. It occurs, unfortunately, in a wide-ranging number of places, and Ukraine will probably be one of them. I think the goal, as the president has stated, is to get to an enduring peace where the two sides are not in active conflict, which requires concessions, frankly, on both sides. An unfortunate outcome, but I think better than seeing a continual, perpetual conflict, which is terminably without end right now, unless they can get to some successful negotiation terms.
Rob Greenway, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, Mark.
Thank you to Rob Greenway for his contribution to today's episode. You can find more of his work at heritage.org, and you can follow him on X at RC Greenway. And thanks as always to you for listening to Heritage Explains. You can reach out to us with any thoughts, questions, or suggestions at heritageexplains@heritage.org. Take care. We'll see you next week.
Heritage Explains is written and produced by Mark Gagne, Lauren Evans, and John Popp.